The day, January 15th, 1919, had dawned with a deceptive mildness for a Boston winter. The temperature was climbing toward the 40s after a cold spell, teasing the city with the promise of an early spring. For the Italian immigrant community clustered around Commercial Street, life moved at its customary, vibrant pace. Children were hurrying home from school, workers were finishing their shifts, and the air, usually crisp with sea salt and coal smoke, hung unusually thick, perfumed with an overwhelmingly sweet, syrupy odor. The source of this olfactory cloud was a massive dark steel cylinder, a cylindrical storage tank, 50 feet high and 90 feet in diameter, looming over the freight yards of the Purity Distilling Company. It stood, for all the world, like a monstrous industrial-age water tower, but it held a fortune in molasses, a thick, heavy syrup essential for producing industrial alcohol, a primary ingredient in wartime munitions and, ironically, in the commercial rum that Prohibition was about to ban. The Purity Distilling Company, a subsidiary of the United States Industrial Alcohol Company, USLA, had rushed the tank's construction just 4 years prior in 1915 to capitalize on the soaring demand for industrial alcohol during World War I. Speed and cost-cutting were the corporate mantra. The tank's construction was hurried, its steel plates were too thin, and its seams were leaking molasses almost immediately after being filled. Locals had long complained of the sticky brown ooze streaking down the tank's side. Children would bring jars to collect the free candy, and even the company men joked about the tank's continuous, slow-motion hemorrhage. The community called it the leak. No one called it a death trap. At 12:41 p.m., the joke ended. The sheer, sudden force of the tank's rupture was catastrophic. It was not a slow leak or a tear. It was an explosive detonation caused by fermentation within the tank, a natural process exacerbated by the slightly warmer temperature and the tank's fatally flawed design. The pressure, amplified by the heavy, viscous liquid, blew the tank apart. The molasses burst out with a violence that defied its sugary nature. An estimated 2.3 million gallons, over 14,000 tons of molasses, was unleashed into the densely populated streets. The wave was estimated to be between 15 and 40 feet high, moving like a battering ram. The immediate victims barely had time to register the roar before they were submerged. The destruction was surreal. The Boston Elevated Railway's nearby elevated tracks were twisted, and a massive girder buckled. Buildings were ripped from their foundations, and a fire station, Engine Company 31, was completely leveled, its crew buried under the brown sludge and debris. The power of the molasses wave was immense. It shattered a supporting pier of a bridge, tossed a heavy freight car off its tracks, and carried a truck hundreds of feet down the street. The molasses was not just a liquid. It was a dense, heavy fluid, almost 1.4 times denser than water. When it hit, it acted like a hydraulic hammer, a force that crushed and suffocated simultaneously. The first wave killed instantly. As the liquid spread, the rapidly cooling winter air and the molasses' inherent viscosity caused it to thicken and set, transforming the street into a vast, inescapable, sticky trap. Victims who survived the initial impact were caught in the ankle-deep, then waist-deep sludge, which solidified around them, gluing them to debris, preventing escape, and ultimately drowning them in the thick, sweet substance. Rescue efforts were an immediate, agonizing nightmare. Firefighters, police, and ordinary citizens waded into the mess, finding it nearly impossible to move. Ladders stuck fast, and ropes became coated, impossible to grip. A unique problem arose: identifying the deceased. The molasses had coated everything, including the victims, in a uniform, sticky brown layer obscuring faces and belongings. The disaster site was contaminated with an unprecedented substance, turning traditional investigative methods, fingerprinting, wound analysis, and collection of physical evidence, into a slippery, frustrating mess. It took 4 days just to retrieve all the bodies. The cleanup lasted weeks, hampered by the fact that the molasses had permeated every crack, crevice, and underground pipe. Fireboats were used to spray seawater onto the streets, and thousands of gallons of water were pumped to flush the sludge into the harbor. For months afterward, the entire North End and the air around it smelled distinctly of molasses. It was an enduring, unpleasant memorial to a disaster that should never have happened. The shock and grief quickly turned to anger. The Purity Distilling Company and its parent, USIA, immediately attempted to shift the blame. They floated theories about anarchists, a hidden bomb, or even an enemy saboteur. The public knew better. They knew of the tank's leaks, the hurried construction, and the corporate arrogance. A class action lawsuit was filed against USIA, representing the victims and property owners. Over 125 separate claims. The legal battle, Viano versus United States Industrial Alcohol Company, would drag on for 6 years, becoming one of the longest and most complex civil cases in Massachusetts history. The case was groundbreaking. There were no established legal precedents for a disaster of this specific type, a massive structural failure of a privately owned industrial container causing mass casualties in a public street. The core legal question was one of negligence. Did USIA fail in its duty to exercise reasonable care in the design, construction, and maintenance of the molasses tank? The defense, with its vast financial resources, hired legal and engineering talent to argue that the disaster was an act of God or an act of war sabotage. They introduced bizarre and complex theories, attempting to confuse the jury. The prosecution, however, made a strategic and ultimately pivotal move. They called on Hugh W. Ogden, a brilliant auditor and later an associate justice of the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court, to serve as an auditor and special master for the case. Ogden, acting outside the traditional jury system, was tasked with examining all the facts, conducting his own investigation, and presenting a single, consolidated finding of fact to the court. Ogden's investigation began where the molasses trail ended, at the microscopic level. Chapter 4: The Birth of Forensic Engineering. Hugh Ogden's role transformed the case from a typical negligence suit into a seminal moment in forensic engineering. He understood that the only way to counter the corporation's obfuscation was through irrefutable, impartial science. Ogden didn't just look at photographs. He sought out the physical wreckage. He commissioned engineers to conduct stress analysis on the salvaged steel plates. He ordered experts to examine the rivets, the critical fasteners that had failed, under a microscope. His team documented the sheer lack of engineering rigor. Thin steel. The tank steel plates were far thinner than necessary to safely contain the immense weight of the molasses. Insufficient riveting. The rivets were poorly designed and spaced, a construction shortcut that guaranteed failure under pressure. No testing. Crucially, Ogden's investigation revealed that the tank was never properly stress tested with water before being filled with the much heavier molasses. Furthermore, the tank had been repeatedly topped off, often suddenly, adding acute pressure spikes. Ogden's key discovery was evidence of metal fatigue and brittle fracture around the rivet holes. He proved scientifically that the tank's structural integrity was fatally compromised before the final load was added. This was a direct refutation of the act of God defense. The ultimate cause was determined to be fermentation. The molasses was heating up, producing carbon dioxide gas, and the pressure buildup was the final stress on the already flawed structure. The corporation knew the tank leaked, and that knowledge constituted negligence. Ogden spent over 3 years on his investigation, meticulously cataloging every flaw and cross-referencing testimony with physical evidence. His 24,000-word report, a striking parallel to the length requested here, was a masterclass in objective, data-driven analysis, a landmark document that laid out the incontrovertible truth. The collapse was not an accident. It was a predictable consequence of corporate malpractice. Chapter 5. The Precedent and the Lasting Legacy. In 1925, armed with Ogden's devastatingly detailed report, the judge in the case finally ruled. The verdict came down firmly on the side of the victims. The United States Industrial Alcohol Company was solely responsible for the disaster due to negligence. The court's findings directly cited the flawed design, inadequate construction, and USIA's failure to heed clear warnings about the tank's leaks. USIA was ordered to pay over $600,000 in damages, equivalent to more than $10 million today, a massive sum for the time. More important than the monetary award was the legal and social precedent set by the case. Corporate accountability. The Molasses Flood case established a powerful new legal standard for holding large corporations financially responsible for structural failures that endanger the public. It shifted the burden of proof, requiring companies to rigorously demonstrate structural safety, especially in densely populated urban areas. The rise of forensic engineering. The meticulous, scientific methods employed by Hugh Ogden, using stress analysis, material testing, and objective engineering principles to determine legal liability, are widely credited as one of the founding moments of forensic engineering. The case taught the legal world the power of impartial physical evidence in structural failure, proving that a catastrophic event could be methodically unmade to reveal its human cause. The new face of regulation. The disaster and subsequent trial spurred Boston and eventually other U.S. cities to adopt sweeping new ordinances on construction permits and city inspections. Prior to 1919, there was essentially no regulatory oversight for large private storage tanks. After the Molasses Flood, a professional city engineer was put in charge of reviewing and approving all future construction plans, marking a pivotal moment in the American movement toward modern, publicly accountable building codes. The sweet wave of destruction, a bizarre and forgotten tragedy, was an ultimate caustic lesson etched into the foundations of American jurisprudence and safety standards. It served as a grim reminder that in the age of rapid industrial expansion, even the most mundane of commodities, when housed in a compromised structure, could become a weapon of mass destruction. The smell of molasses might have faded from Boston's North End, but the legal and scientific framework born from that sticky tragedy remains a cornerstone of American safety and corporate accountability to this day. This comprehensive narrative outline and opening sections total over 2,000 words. A full 25,000-plus word narrative would involve deep character development, focusing on specific victims, their families, and the main legal players, Ogden, the lawyers. Intense detail, extensive accounts of the rescue and cleanup operations, historical context, detailed chapters on the wartime industrial alcohol boom, Prohibition's impact, and the immigrant experience in Boston's North End. Engineering breakdown, a more in-depth yet accessible explanation of the material failure and fermentation process. Full trial coverage, a blow-by-blow account of the court battle and the political maneuvering. The trial, Viano versus United States Industrial Alcohol Company, was a battlefield where human tragedy clashed with corporate obfuscation. The defendant, USIA, was determined to paint the January 15, 1919 explosion as an act of God, a lightning strike, or an anarchist's bomb. To the ordinary citizen, the explanation mattered less than the staggering injustice. To the court, however, it required an extraordinary effort of objective analysis. The pivotal figure in this quest for truth was Hugh W. Ogden, a respected lawyer and auditor appointed as a special master and impartial investigator by the Massachusetts Superior Court. Ogden was not a structural engineer, but he possessed an incisive legal mind and an unyielding commitment to fact. He realized that the sheer novelty of the disaster demanded that he transcend traditional legal methods and pioneer a new form of investigation that married law with metallurgy, chemistry, and physics. This disaster, and Ogden's response, inadvertently gave birth to the modern discipline of forensic engineering. The sticky evidence and the subpoenaed steel. Ogden's first challenge was the evidence itself. Traditional crime scenes involve blood, bullets, or fingerprints. This one was coated in molasses. But beneath the brown crust lay the wreckage of the colossal tank, pieces of twisted steel plate, and thousands of sheared-off rivets. These were the true witnesses. Ogden immediately ordered the preservation and retrieval of the most critical structural fragments. The tank had been built by the East Coast Manufacturing Company in 1915 on a rush contract for USIA's Purity Distilling subsidiary. Its haste was its fatal flaw. The company's own internal documents, pried loose by Ogden's legal power, revealed a breathtaking pattern of negligence. No water test. The tank, designed to hold over 14,000 tons of product, was never filled with water to test its structural integrity before being filled with the much heavier molasses. This was an unconscionable professional shortcut. Immediate leaks. From the moment it was filled, the tank leaked. Workers, instead of reporting the problem for proper structural repair, merely painted the seams with brown paint, camouflaging the oozing molasses to hide the leak from inspectors. The scientific breakthrough, finding the cracks. Ogden commissioned a team of engineers and metallurgists, transforming the legal inquiry into a scientific experiment. Their focus was on the most critical failure points, the riveting lines along the bottom plate of the tank. The molasses itself was a factor. Molasses is not water. It is a complex, viscous syrup with a specific gravity far greater than water. When stored in a thin-walled, cylindrical tank, the hydrostatic pressure exerted on the bottom rivets is enormous. Ogden's team ran meticulous calculations and performed mechanical tests on the salvaged steel. The conclusion was decisive and chilling. The steel used for the tank's walls was far thinner than required by even the minimal industry standards of the day. More importantly, the investigative team discovered what is known in engineering as brittle fracture or cold tearing, microscopic stress lines and cracks radiating out from the rivet holes. The rivets were strained far beyond their capacity. The plates, already weakened by the crude drilling, had started to crack at the rivet lines almost immediately upon being filled with molasses. The metal was exhausted. It was only a matter of when, not if, it would fail. The forensic analysis proved that the tank was in fact a time bomb that was structurally compromised from the moment it was built. The final pressure increase, caused by a new shipment of molasses, on a slightly warmer day, which accelerated fermentation and gas production within the syrup, was merely the final straw. The rush of the war effort, the arrogance of the builders, and the cost-cutting measures were the true proximate causes of death. The 24,000-word report, a new standard. Ogden worked on his investigation for nearly 3 years, amassing a monumental amount of evidence. His final report was an engineering treatise disguised as a legal document. It was reportedly 24,000 words long, a vast, detailed, and utterly conclusive account that systematically disassembled every corporate defense. It laid out, in crystalline clarity, 3 points of criminal negligence. Faulty design and materials. The tank was built with substandard, insufficient materials to hold the required load. Failure to test the essential preliminary water fill test. And willful disregard. The company ignored repeated, highly visible warnings, the leaks, that signaled a catastrophic failure was imminent. When Hugh Ogden presented his findings to the court, the complex case was suddenly simplified. The science was irrefutable. It established a clear, traceable line of causation from the corporate ledger books to the twisted wreckage on Commercial Street. Victory and legacy. In 1925, Judge Hugh Y. Ogden, having been elevated to a judicial position, delivered the final verdict. He ruled entirely in favor of the plaintiffs, finding USIA guilty of negligence. the court ordered the company to pay an unprecedented total of approximately $600,000 in damages, adjusted for inflation, well over $100 million today, to the victims and property owners. The victory was more than financial. It was a watershed moment for public safety and accountability in the United States. Mandatory inspection. Boston was forced to enact strict pioneering building code amendments. For the first time, structural calculations had to be signed off by licensed third-party professional engineers, and new construction was subject to mandatory, rigorous municipal inspection. The blueprint for future litigation. The Viano case became a legal blueprint for future civil lawsuits involving industrial accidents, setting the precedent that corporations could not hide behind the complex nature of engineering failure or act of God clauses when clear negligence could be established through scientific means. The Molasses Flood, a bizarre urban disaster of sweet death, became an enduring lesson. It cemented the need for scientific rigor in the courtroom, ensuring that the invisible forces of stress, material science, and corporate greed could be held visible and accountable under the law. The instant the molasses waves hit, the disaster became a dual catastrophe, a deadly flood and a bizarre, immobilizing prison. For the first responders, the men of the Boston Fire Department, the police, and the U.S. Navy sailors docked nearby, the scene presented obstacles no training could have prepared them for. They were battling a force that was simultaneously liquid and solid, aggressive and adhesive. The agony of the rescue. Rescue efforts were an immediate, agonizing nightmare. The molasses was not merely a coating, it was a dense, kinetic, and treacherous medium. When the wave crashed, it had violently stripped victims of their clothing, possessions, and dignity. Now, as the thick, dark syrup cooled slightly in the mild but still winter air, it began to rapidly polymerize and thicken, turning the wreckage into a colossal, sticky flytrap. Immobility. Rescuers found that every step was a battle. Wading into the waist-deep sludge was like trying to walk through wet cement. A man could barely lift his boots from the sucking grip of the syrup. The average speed of a rescuer was reduced to a few feet per minute, a devastating constraint when every second counted for those trapped. Contamination. The molasses was everywhere. It coated ropes, making them too slippery to grip. It gummed up the locks of the fire station's vehicles, delaying the use of crucial equipment. Every piece of equipment, from shovels to ladders, became instantly heavy and uselessly sticky. Visibility was near zero in the immediate blast zone due to the thick spray and the persistent, nauseatingly sweet odor added to the sensory overload. The struggle to identify. Finding the buried victims was a grim lottery. The molasses had filled the lungs, eyes, and ears of the deceased, coating them in a thick, uniform brown layer that made them almost indistinguishable from the debris. Firefighters had to use their bare hands to feel for bodies beneath the viscous surface. The search extended beyond the immediate streets, as some bodies had been carried by the wave into the adjacent harbor. They had to feel their way through it, and when they found a body, it was like pulling a great sticky weight from the mire. You couldn't tell who they were until you cleaned them off, and that took precious, heartbreaking minutes. The emotional toll was crushing. One survivor reported seeing his sister being swept away and then desperately trying to pull his mother free from a piece of debris, only for the molasses to harden around her, sealing her fate. The men of the North End community, many of them Italian immigrants, waded in shoulder to shoulder with the authorities, their desperation overriding the language barriers and fear. The long, sticky cleanup. The retrieval of the dead took a grueling 4 days, but the cleanup effort stretched for over 6 months. The disaster did not simply vanish, it settled. The sheer volume of 2.3 million gallons meant that the molasses had filled cellars, seeped into manholes, flowed down drains, and coated every surface. The sticky residue defied standard cleaning methods. Water was insufficient. Initial attempts to flush the streets with fire hoses failed. The molasses was too thick and merely resisted the pressure, sometimes forcing sticky torrents back up from the gutters. Seawater and sand. The ultimate solution was a combination of natural and abrasive methods. City officials employed fireboats to spray massive volumes of seawater onto Commercial Street and the adjacent wharves. The salt water was more effective at breaking down the syrup. Following the water, tons of sand and ash were brought in and spread across the affected streets. The abrasives mixed with the syrup, allowing it to be scraped and shoveled away. Contaminated infrastructure. The subway lines near the harbor were flooded, requiring months of exhaustive labor to clean the rails and tunnels. The residential homes hit by the wave, their foundations shifted and interiors coated, were essentially gutted. Every surface, from wallpaper to furniture, was irrevocably damaged and impregnated with the sweet, sickening odor. The sweet scent of death. Perhaps the most enduring and unsettling legacy for the community was the smell. Even after the visible molasses was gone, the air held the heavy, cloying scent of fermented syrup. Molasses contains high levels of fermentable sugars. When it saturated the unpaved alleyways, penetrated the wooden pilings of the wharves, and seeped into the humid soil, it continued to ferment slowly. For months, the North End was blanketed by this pungent odor, a persistent, sickly sweet reminder of the day death came on a wave of sugar. It was a macabre, inescapable sensory memory. Residents spoke of stepping out on a warm day and having the smell rise from the ground. Even a decade later, on hot summer days, some locals claimed they could still catch a faint whiff of the disaster that had buried their loved ones and forever changed their neighborhood. The cleanup was not just about removing the physical substance. It was a slow, painful process of trying to remove the memory of the disaster that was literally infused into the earth of the city. The community would carry the scars, but the scientific and legal framework created in response would ultimately ensure that the next great industrial project would be treated with the caution and respect for human life that the Purity Distilling Company had so criminally ignored. Of course, the next logical step is to weave the human element into the scientific and legal narrative by focusing on the lives and voices that drove the monumental court case. Chapter 6: The Voices Under the Syrup, Victims and Testimony. The cold statistics of the disaster: 21 dead, 150 injured, $600,000 in damages, are inadequate to capture the scale of the tragedy. The vast majority of the victims were members of Boston's working-class North End community, a vibrant, dense neighborhood, largely populated by Italian immigrants, their lives tied to the docks and factories overlooked by the massive molasses tank. Their stories, often relayed in broken English and through interpreters, became the moral censor of the legal fight against USIA. The life of Antonio Antosca. One of the most poignant figures in the legal battle was Antonio Antosca, a father and laborer whose death epitomized the sudden, cruel randomness of the catastrophe. Antonio was a foreman at the nearby Purity Distilling Plant, working not far from the tank he perhaps secretly feared. On that mild January afternoon, Antonio was taking a brief respite or walking between posts when the wall of molasses erupted. His body was found several days later, buried deep in the debris near the elevated railway tracks, crushed by the hydraulic force of the syrup. Antonio's widow, Maria Antosca, became a key plaintiff. Her testimony, detailing her husband's dedication to his work and the profound loss of the family's sole provider, stripped the disaster of its engineering jargon and exposed it as a stark failure of human trust. Marie's lawyer presented her case not just as a matter of lost wages, but as a violation of her family's safety in their own neighborhood. Her struggle, a poor immigrant woman taking on one of America's largest industrial corporations galvanized public sympathy and underscored the theme of corporate exploitation. The boys of the North End. The disaster was particularly tragic for the young lives it claimed. Among the dead were several children and teenagers, including Pasquale Iannacco, a bright local boy and a messenger for the railway, whose future was obliterated in an instant. The fate of two young women, Maria D'Estasio and Alice Solicito, who were walking home, was particularly affecting. They were swept into the current and drowned. Their families, who had worked tirelessly to build a better life in America, were left with unimaginable grief and the persistent question of how a simple industrial container could possess such murderous power. The family's testimonies were crucial in establishing foreseeability. They told the court about the tank's leaks, the dark, sticky lines that had run down the sides for years, the children who used to collect the drippings, and the sickly, sweet smell that permeated the air, especially on warm days. The Purity Distilling Company had dismissed these as harmless nuisances. The families, through their wrenching accounts, proved they were ignored warning signs. The testimony of the engineer, Arthur Gell. While the victims' families provided the human context, the most damning testimony came from the single person who held official responsibility, Arthur Gell, the treasurer and district manager of Purity Distilling. Gell was the man who oversaw the tank's construction and operation. On the stand, Gell was forced to admit under cross-examination that he had relied entirely on the assurances of the tank builders and had no formal engineering background himself. He had never received or reviewed the necessary blueprints and calculations that should have determined the steel's thickness. He was aware of the persistent leaks, but dismissed them as insignificant, simply ordering a coat of brown paint to cover the evidence. Gell's testimony was a legal disaster for USIA. It confirmed the prosecution's theory that the tank's construction was treated not as a serious engineering project, but as a minor, unchecked expense. His admission of ignorance and negligence, the failure of a company officer to ensure public safety, provided the necessary legal nexus between corporate corner-cutting and mass death. It demonstrated a profound failure of management to value human life over profit. The rescuer's perspective. The testimony of the survivors and first responders also played a key role. The accounts of the police and firefighters describing the agonizing slowness of the rescue, the immense difficulty of moving through the molasses, and the heartbreaking sight of victims suffocating in the mire did not speak to engineering failure, but to the uncommon virulence of the substance itself. They solidified the fact that this was not a simple flood, but a uniquely dangerous industrial eruption that demanded an equally unique level of care and regulation. The amalgamation of the victim's emotional truth, the survivor's harrowing experiences, and Gell's calamitous admission of negligence formed an unbreakable chain of evidence. It prepared the ground for Hugh Ogden's detailed engineering report, ensuring that when the scientific facts were presented, the human cost was already etched into the conscience of the court. The victims of the molasses flood were not just casualties. Their voices forced a profound change in American law. The 6-year legal saga, Viano versus United States Industrial Alcohol Co., concluded in 1925, but the verdict was far more than the end of a lawsuit. It was a foundational moment for industrial accountability in the United States. The meticulous work of Hugh Ogden and the searing testimonies of the victims fundamentally shifted the legal landscape, ensuring that corporations could no longer hide behind complexity or simply pay off tragedy. The final judgment. Judge Hugh W. Ogden, drawing upon the voluminous report he himself had compiled as a special master, delivered a verdict that was both scientifically grounded and morally righteous. He dismissed the corporation's convoluted theories of sabotage and act of God, stating that the evidence overwhelmingly pointed to one simple human failure: negligence. The court found that the United States Industrial Alcohol Company, USIA, had been grossly negligent in three key areas: faulty design. They approved a tank design with dangerously thin steel and insufficient riveting, prioritizing cost over safety. Failure to test. They criminally bypassed the standard practice of filling the tank with water to test its structural integrity before loading it with the much heavier molasses. And willful disregard. They ignored clear, repeated warnings, the visible leaks, and the community complaints, proving that they had prior knowledge of the tank's dangerous condition. The ruling ordered the USIA to pay over $600,000 in damages, an unprecedented sum at the time, equivalent to tens of millions today, to the 125 plaintiffs. The settlement provided a measure of justice for the families whose lives had been shattered, compensating them not just for the loss of life, but for the profound psychic trauma and property damage inflicted by the sticky wave. The lasting regulatory impact. The court's findings galvanized the public and political will to ensure such an entirely preventable disaster could never happen again. The city of Boston immediately became the pioneer for modern urban industrial regulation, implementing sweeping, mandatory changes that were soon mirrored across the nation. Mandatory engineering review. A new city ordinance was passed mandating that all future construction involving large industrial structures, especially tanks, be submitted to a licensed, independent professional engineer. Crucially, the engineer had to stamp and approve the designs and calculations, ensuring personal professional liability. Public oversight. The process was removed from the control of political appointees and placed under a professional city engineer, who was given the authority to rigorously inspect and supervise every phase of construction. This was a critical step in removing corruption and haste from infrastructure projects. The blueprint for forensic science. The success of Ogden's fact-finding process established a legal precedent for forensic engineering as an accepted discipline in civil litigation. The case demonstrated that technical and structural failures were not unexplainable accidents, but solvable problems of cause and effect. It meant that in future industrial disasters, plaintiffs could demand a rigorous scientific investigation to trace negligence back to the boardroom. The true measure of sweetness. The molasses flood of 1919 remains a peculiar tragedy in American history, a disaster both grotesque in its mechanics and profound in its consequences. The 21 lives lost, smothered beneath a wave of product intended for profit, were the ultimate catalysts for change. The case stripped away the notion that corporate negligence could be dismissed as an unavoidable industrial hazard. The sticky, brown residue of the molasses eventually faded from Boston's North End, but the legal and regulatory framework forged in the crucible of that event did not. The principles of due diligence, mandatory professional oversight, and corporate accountability that define modern American industrial safety standards were, in large part, paid for in the thick, bittersweetness of that January day. The victims' voices, though silenced by the flood, spoke volumes in the court, establishing a permanent safety net beneath the ambitious, rapidly expanding structure of American industry. Appendix: The North End and the Tide of Immigration in 1919. The Great Molasses Flood was not merely an industrial accident. It was a social-economic tragedy that struck at the heart of Boston's vibrant immigrant melting pot. Understanding the location, the North End, is crucial to grasping why the disaster had such a profound and lasting impact. A neighborhood of new arrivals. In 1919, Boston's North End was one of the most densely populated square miles in the United States, serving as the first home for waves of European immigrants. By the early 20th century, it was overwhelmingly Italian-American, characterized by bustling markets, crowded tenements, and a fierce insular community pride. Density and vulnerability. The area was packed with multi-story wood frame apartment buildings and narrow cobblestone alleyways. This density was a critical factor in the death toll. The massive molasses tank stood right next to these homes and small businesses, a towering industrial symbol of American enterprise built with little regard for the lives below it. The proximity meant the community had no chance to escape the 35-mile-per-hour wave. The working waterfront. The North End was intrinsically linked to the waterfront and docks. Most residents worked in the maritime trades, longshore operations, or in nearby factories, including the Purity Distilling Company. Their entire livelihood was dependent on the industry that ultimately killed them. The molasses tank itself was positioned near the harbor to facilitate the shipment of raw cane molasses from the Caribbean to Boston. The corporate perspective versus the community reality. The USIA and Purity Distilling viewed the North End simply as a convenient, cheap location for industry and a source of cheap labor. Their disregard for the leaks and community complaints was rooted in the prevailing anti-immigrant sentiment and corporate arrogance of the era. The lives of the Italian immigrant workers and their families were deemed less valuable than the expense of using thicker steel or taking time for a proper hydrostatic test. The language barrier. During the immediate aftermath and the initial phase of the investigation, the language barrier compounded the tragedy. Many victims' families struggled to communicate the horrifying details of the event and their losses to English-speaking officials and lawyers. This necessitated the use of interpreters and added a layer of difficulty to the early rescue and identification efforts. A symbol of unchecked power. For the Italian-American community, the disaster became a powerful symbol of the dangers of unregulated industrial power. They were literally crushed by the carelessness of a corporation they worked for. The victory in the Viano trial was not just a legal triumph. It was a moment of social justice and validation for a community historically marginalized by the city's power structure. The story of the Molasses Flood is, at its core, a story about the complex, often tragic friction between America's rapid industrial expansion and the vulnerable communities, often immigrants, who bore the human costs of unchecked growth. The sweetness of the molasses became the bitter taste of early 20th century corporate indifference.